2024 NHL free agency is quickly approaching, and this year's free agent class is pretty ridiculous. Especially on the forward side of things, there are multiple high-end NHL players that will get big contracts and big paydays on July 1st. But in this year's free agent crop, who are the best goalies, defensemen, forwards? Well, we're going to be ranking the top 25 best FAs this year to see who your team could potentially sign, where they could go, and what contracts they might end up getting. So make sure you watch till the end for all the rankings and all of the breakdowns, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content and free agency content just like this as we lead up to July 1st. Now let's start out the top 25 list, actually with the only goaltender on the list. This year is pretty weak, and even though there's a few other goalies like Marc-Andre Fleury, Ilya Samsonov, David Rittich, to me the best guy on the market actually comes from the LA Kings in Cam Talbot. Now, even though I do think he is the best goalie available in free agency, as you can tell, this crop isn't really all that great for goalies. I do think if you want to have a goalie that saves your goaltending tandem, you'll want to definitely trade for one. But in Talbot's case, I think he can still do solidly. Even though he turns 37 on July 1st, he's been pretty good with LA this year. A .915 save percentage in 48 games, and he's a plus 15 goals saved above expected. Even though there's been some inconsistencies this year, Talbot has been pretty good for a solid LA team, and is one of the reasons why they're still in the playoff race right now. Though, again, I wouldn't lean on him to be the true starter because with his age, you never really know. Next up, we go on to a player that has really revived his career value over the past year, whether that be playing with the Caps and being traded to Vegas and continuing the production there. At number 24, I'm going to go with Anthony Mantha of the Vegas Golden Knights, who at 29 years old is in a really unique position as a free agent. I don't have him too high on this list, but I could see him getting one of the bigger paydays out of anybody. The thing is, though, the health has been a big resurgence this year for him, and you can see in 76 games, he's on pace for 44 points. With the player we're talking about here, with the size, with the goal scoring he's had this year, I think we're going to see him get a pretty good chunk of change, and this might be the last really big payday for Mantha. Though I could see a situation where he has to sign maybe shorter term to get the AAV he wants, because I could still see some teams being hesitant about him. Now we move on to the first D of the list here, and definitely not the last. It's a pretty solid one for defensemen this year. And next up, we're going to go to Chris Tanev, who was a brilliant free agent signing by the Flames a couple years back, but of course, as a rental for the Dallas Stars, we'll likely see him on the free agent market. And at 34 years old, you can obviously see that age, but even though there has been some wear and tear, he's been really solid over these past couple of years, whether it be for the Flames, whether it be for the Stars, in that defensive, physical role. You know what you're getting out of Chris Tanev. You're not going to be getting much production, but in the defensive end, he's going to be an absolute stalwart, and I think he's going to get paid like it. I don't know if this next deal will be as good as his deal with Calgary, but I could see around the same AAV, around maybe 4 or 5 million, and maybe a shorter term deal like 2 or 3 years. Though I could see Tanev getting a bigger payday than people realize just because of the name recognition and also just how efficient he's been recently. Next up, we're going to move on to number 22, and easily one of the most undervalued guys in this free agent crop, a guy that I could see being really underpaid and a really good budget-friendly D to acquire, and that's going to be Matt Roy of the LA Kings. At 29 years old, he is a pretty fascinating D, just a quiet, efficient guy on both ends of the ice. And you can see 22 points in 73 games this year. You're not going to get unreal production, but this is a guy that, again, is quiet, is sturdy, is solid, isn't going to overwhelm your defense. I think he's more of a depth at the end of the day, but as a guy that could be maybe a 4 or 50, and you can get around maybe $3 million, I think Roy could be a really interesting bet for anybody out there. Though I could see maybe getting a little bit more. Maybe he's able to run up that market price, but I don't know. I feel like he just goes under the radar, and some team is going to end up stealing. Next up, we go on to number 21, and another trade deadline acquisition from this last deadline being on the market. And next up, we got Adam Henrique of the Edmonton Oilers, newly of the Oilers, of course, over the past month. And you can see what he's been able to do over the course of this year. Anaheim, great production there. And with Edmonton, so far, the goal scoring has been pretty solid. 5 points in 13 games. I think with Henrique, again, it's the name recognition. It's also just about the leadership he provides. And I think a lot of teams are going to be after him on a shorter term deal, higher AAV, kind of like what we saw with Pavelski a few years back, going from the Sharks to the Stars. I think Henrique is going to be pretty similarly valued, and a guy that a lot of teams are going to want to go after, acquire, and see if they can capture. Now we go on to the top 20, and next up at number 20 here, we're going to another player that has had a great season, this time the Colorado Avalanche, in Jonathan Drouin. And it's pretty interesting with Drouin, especially with the health that he's had this year. We've seen him points-wise get back up to a great level, and obviously in Colorado is in a great position for him. In 72 games, has 15 goals, 48 points, alongside McKinnon for a decent stretch, has been a great partner for him, and he's in the perfect situation. Maybe he ends up staying with Colorado, but I could see a situation where he tries to maximize that value and get a big contract on the open market. Personally, I wouldn't do it, especially if you're looking for him to be more than a complimentary player, but it will be very fascinating to see the interest in Drouin if he hits FA. Now we're going to get into the rest of the top 20 and all the full breakdowns, but first let's talk about today's sponsor in Sleeper Fantasy. If you guys don't know already, Sleeper Fantasy is the best place to turn your hockey knowledge into daily paydays, and with today we got 4 different picks on the docket. First, we're going to go JJ Peterka, more than 2.5 shots on goal versus Washington. He's continued to hit this pretty consistently over the past few games. I also got Filip Forsberg, more than 0.5 points versus Boston. Nashville, of course, with their incredible run. Even though it's come to a close as of recent, I think they're going to continue to do well. Forsberg has been a big part of that. I also got Luke Hughes, a little bit of a kind of a risky one here, let's say. More than 0.5 points versus the Penguins, and I think Hughes could get a pretty good streak going here. And I also got Cole Caulfield. Usually he's my boy, but I'm actually going to go less than 3.5 shots on goal here. He has been failing to hit that over the past few games, really, and he's got, I could see kind of going a little bit cold versus a team like Florida that has that physical presence, strong defensive game. I'm going to put $10 down to win 58 and see how it goes. To make your own daily NHL picks, go in the description, click on the link, and sign up to Sleeper Fantasy. And on your first deposit, use promo code GRAV, and you'll get up to a $500 match. And also DM me on Twitter what your picks are as well, so we can get that going too. And thank you so much to Sleeper for sponsoring today's video. Now let's go on to number 19, and a player that has really been an underrated guy as well coming into this whole free agency process, and a guy that bet on himself going to the Florida Panthers, and I think it's going to pay dividends in Oliver Ekman-Larsson, who of course had that massive contract with Arizona and Vancouver, eventually would get bought out, and he just signed a 1-year deal, $2.25 million with Florida, and so far he has been pretty solid in the role that was given. In 75 games this year, has 30 points, and especially earlier on in the season, was a pretty big part of Florida's defense, and he's a guy that I could actually see getting a pretty underrated payday, maybe around the $4 or $5 million range, a guy that, again, bet on himself in a big way to just take a 1-year deal, and in free agency, I think teams are going to be lining up to get him. Next, we're going on to number 18, and we're going to go to another player that bet on himself here, and next up, we got Patrick Kane of the Detroit Red Wings, who is going to be a really interesting free agent, and even though it seems like Detroit is unlikely to re-sign him, he had a pretty good stint with them, especially if they're going to make the playoffs. He's been a big reason for that. In 43 games, 18 goals, 24 assists, 42 points. It seems like that health has finally come and turned a page, which is huge for him. And even though he is on the older side of things, turning 36 November, it's Patrick Kane. Teams are going to want to go after him, especially now that he's proved that he can be healthy and play pretty good doing it. Next up, we move on to number 17, and another pretty big name D here. Next up, we got Brady Shea, and it's pretty interesting because you have Shea, you have Pesce as well in free agency, who just missed my list here. But with the Canes, they have a lot of potential UFAs on the blue line. With Shea, though, at 30 years old, it might be best to, maybe 31 years old by the time free agency comes around, might be best to potentially get rid of him. But you see at what he's been able to do, the consistent rate at which he scored for Carolina as an offensive D, hovering around that 40-point range, and this year, 42 points in 75 games. Really underrated goal scorer, especially over the past couple of years, too. 18 goals, then 13 goals this year. He's really starting to find his gear there. Could be a really interesting two-way D that you place on your middle pair and just get serviceable results out of. I actually just realized his goal scoring is so good that he's 5th among defensemen in goal scoring over the past couple of years. That's not too bad. Now we go from one Canes offensive D to a former Canes offensive D, and next up we're going to go to another defenseman in Shayne Gostisbehere, who is another really good D on this market, and I think could get a lot more term than his last deal with Detroit. You can see this year in 74 games with the Red Wings, he's gotten some pretty great numbers, and the best numbers since his first year in Arizona. 10 goals, 39 assists, 49 points. We know what Gostisbehere is. He's going to be running your power play. He's going to be a great guy on the man advantage, and that's what Gostisbehere brings to your roster. Not much else, but hey, at least Gostisbehere fills a role, and he's going to get paid because of that role. Now we get inside the top 15 free agents, and next up we're going to go to a guy that was traded at the deadline as well this year in Sean Monahan, who is really going to be a fascinating free agent. Does he get term? How much does he get? Especially with the health history, it's kind of interesting. But you see what he was able to do with Montreal, 35 points in 49 games. Rightfully got a lot of value back for the Habs at the deadline. And you can see what he's been able to do in Winnipeg as well. Not too shabby there either. In 27 games already, has 11 goals, 8 assists, 19 points. He's fit in pretty well on a Jets team that really has not been performing well over the past few weeks, but he's been pretty good and at a pretty solid level, and I think that could really boost his free agency, especially if he has a good playoffs, stays healthy. Monahan could get a pretty good payday here. Next up at number 14, a guy that signed a one-year deal, and I think it's a lot because of his agent and the poor situation going into the offseason, but I think this player is definitely going to get a much better contract this next offseason, and that's Vladimir Tarasenko. I will say I think he should get a much better contract. He signed a one-year deal with Ottawa at $5 million. And the thing is, it was solid. It was okay. But I think Tarasenko could absolutely get more term, honestly. Even though he turns 33 in December, this is a guy that's just stayed consistent in his offensive production. You can see what he's able to do with Ottawa, 41 points in 57 games there, really being one of their best, most consistent offensive scorers. And then coming into Florida, he's been pretty solid there as well, even though he's had a couple of really good games, which might have bloated up those point totals. He still has 9 points in 12 games with Florida, and he's a guy that I think is just as an offensive second line forward is going to be able to do a lot for you. Have, of course, the leadership, have, of course, that Stanley Cup win, and just a lot of experience for a lot of those younger players. Next up, we go into another offensive top six wing, and I'm going to go with Tyler Toffoli. Just like Sean Monahan was traded to the Winnipeg Jets in the trade deadline season, and has also, like Monahan, been pretty good in that role. 4 goals, 2 assists, 6 points at 11 games, and I think he could have better production. Winnipeg, again, has kind of just been in a weird situation since they've acquired all these guys, but Tyler Toffoli, as an offensive guy who can score some goals, be great on the power play, that's what Toffoli brings. Not a ton of defensive game, but again, you're not paying Toffoli for that. He's still pretty decently in his prime right now at 31 years old, turning 32 in April, and I think could get some pretty good term here, maybe even a 4-year deal. Next up at number 12, we're going to go to a guy that throughout this whole year has risen his stock up a ton, and that's Sean Walker, newly of the Colorado Avalanche. And it's interesting, even though he's gone through 3 different teams over the past year in LA, now Philly, now Colorado, he's been highly valued in a lot of different situations. With Philly this year, he was great as a transitional skating D, getting 22 points in 63 games, and so far Colorado, he's been great on that blue line offensively. 3 goals, 2 assists, 5 points in 11 games there, and to me, he's going to get a really interesting contract, especially considering his age. He's not too old, turning 30 in November, and starting to finally become the player that he could be. He's a guy that I could see not really having too much of an aging curve, considering how he plays, how fluid his skating is. He's not a guy that I see really dropping off all that much, and could even have his best production year with whoever he signs with next season. Now, we just talked about Sean Walker, who throughout this year has probably risen his stock a whole heck of a lot. Now we go on to other free agents this year that has maybe decreased his value the most out of anybody. And going on to Vancouver, I couldn't really think of anybody else that has decreased their value more than Elias Lindholm. And the thing is, even though he's been traded to Vancouver, I think it has almost exacerbated some of the issues. You can see how he was playing with Calgary. He was fine. He was okay. 32 points in 49 games, but 9 goals. Not a lot of production there. And in Vancouver, he hasn't really found his footing either. In 22 games, has 5 goals, 4 assists, 9 points, which again is fine, but it's worse production than he had in Calgary. And I think especially considering the player he was just a couple years ago, getting a point per game back in 2022, 42 goals, the drop-off has been pretty steep these past couple of seasons, and it shows no really signs of getting better, especially with the, of course, injury with Lindholm now, too. With him turning 30 in December, how many teams are going to give him term? That will be the big question. He's injured, and even when he has been healthy, he hasn't really even fit into the top 6 in Vancouver, so his contract is going to be a big one to look out for. Now we actually move on to another Vancouver Canucks UFA. Now, I would say this player is a lot more likely to be re-signed, but of course, still is an option out there, and that is Filip Hronek of the Vancouver Canucks. Now, we have heard some rumors that Vancouver is trying to make a deal happen, trying to get a contract extension signed around, he wants that $8 million range. It might probably come in around maybe 6.5 or so with Hronek, which could be maybe the sweet spot for both parties involved. You can see this year having a breakout year alongside Quinn Hughes, who wouldn't. 46 points in 74 games. He has gone cold as of recently, and to me, he's a guy that I would kind of be hesitant to give big money to. I think he could be a pretty solid number 3 and number 2 guy, but that's about it, and you got to make sure you're restrained in how much money you give him. But even though he'll likely stay in Vancouver, there is the chance that the Canucks are able to find a deal, but I do think with how good he's played alongside Hughes just throughout the year, that they'll find a way to make the deal work. Next up at number 9, another guy that had a really tumultuous offseason last year, but has come into a new situation and has performed incredibly, and that's Matt Duchene of the Dallas Stars. it's pretty fascinating to see just how good of a free agent signing he was. 1 year at $3 million, maybe the best value signing last year, honestly. At 33 years old, he has been terrific for the Stars. In 73 games, his 24 goals, 38 assists for 62 points, has been brilliant on that top six, has rejuvenated Mason Marchment, for instance, with Tyler Seguin as well. That line has been incredible throughout a lot of this season, but he has been a main driver of the bust, playing just so friggin' good. And even though I think he would want to stay in Dallas, I'm not sure if the Stars are going to be able to make the cap work, which could mean Duchesne would be in for a big payday if he went into free agency. Next up, at number 8, we're going to go to another forward here that has a fascinating free agent case. And next up, we're going on to Teuvo Teravainen of the Carolina Hurricanes, who at 29 years old, 30 by the time next year begins, is kind of in a weird position with Carolina. I think most likely he will end up staying with the Canes, but maybe there is a chance that he wants to go somewhere else. You can see over these past few years, hasn't had the most insane production in the world after getting 76 points back in 2019, but still, when he has been healthy, he's been a solid dual threat guy that can pitch in all three zones. Though the value is going to be a big question. Will teams give him upwards of $6 million plus? I'm not quite sure. He might have to maybe have another prove it type deal to make it work, but it'll be interesting to see where he goes, what he goes after, and what contract he'll end up getting. Next up at number 7, we're going to continue to go through the absolute dogs here, and next up we go on to Joe Pavelski, and just like Teravainen, I think that Pavelski is pretty likely to end up staying with his respective team. You can see at 39, he's going to be turning 40 in July, and even though I think he probably could get more on the open market, I think a team like Ottawa or some team that needs a veteran presence would be all over him. We saw him sign a 1-year, $3.5 million deal in the offseason last year, an absolute steal there, and I think we'll likely see that again. He's, again, just been a very consistent, great performer for the Stars, and I think both parties just want to make a deal happen, and it'll probably be around that same AAV as this current deal. Now onto the free agent right outside the top 5. Let's go on to number 6, and the Florida Panthers D in Brandon Montour, and this Panthers offseason is going to be fascinating. They got Montour, they got Oliver Ekman-Larsson, they got as well a name that we haven't even mentioned yet as free agents, big ones at that. And it's going to be pretty hard to re-sign him, especially with how Montour has played these past couple of years offensively. 73 points last year in 80 games and 32 points in 59 games this year. He is going to get paid, though, for sure. He's a guy that's already turned 29, so he's not even on that 30 side yet. But with how consistent he's been offensively these past few seasons, he could get a really interesting bag. I don't know if it's going to be with Florida is the thing. It'll be really tough to re-sign him, but with Florida, we've seen them do the impossible before. Next up at number 5, another team that might have some trouble re-signing their player here in Jonathan Marchessault of the Vegas Golden Knights. We already saw them having to get rid of Riley Smith's contract last offseason after they won the Cup, and Marchessault is going to be a fascinating deal. Considering his age too, turning 34 at the end of this year, it's interesting because he's played so well these past few years, so consistently good for Vegas, won the Conn Smythe with his efforts in the playoffs last year, 40 goals and 63 points in 74 games this season. Marchessault could get a big one. And even though I don't think the term will be massive, I think the AAV absolutely could. I think he's going to get at least $7 million, and I just don't know if Vegas is going to be able to do that. Especially with how good Marchessault's deal already was with Vegas, just making $5 million. Again, that payday, he's going to want a massive upgrade. Next up, let's go on to number 4 and his trade deadline teammate here in Noah Hanifin. Newly, of course, of the Vegas Golden Knights. He hasn't yet signed a deal, and after we saw the big Hanifin deal to Vegas, we heard a lot of rumors about him potentially signing a big extension with him right after, but those haven't happened quite yet. Even though there is the possibility of it happening, you can see in 12 games, he has 5 assists for 5 points. He's been pretty solid for Vegas overall. It's the thing, though, with Vegas is how much they want to commit to a trade deadline acquisition. Will re-signing Hanifin to a massive deal keep them from signing Marchessault? Will it keep them from doing so many other things? That'll be the big question, and that might be a reason why they haven't re-signed him yet. But now we go on to the top 3 free agents, the best of the best. And next up, let's go on to a name that actually could be in the free agency mix. And next up, we got Steven Stamkos of the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, the last time that Steven Stamkos was really in free agency talks was when, of course, there was the possibility of him going to free agency. There was all the rumors about Toronto, and he just ended up staying with Tampa Bay. Womp womp. But this time around, it feels like Stamkos might not want to stay in Tampa after all. We've heard a lot of rumors about maybe Stamkos wanting to leave Tampa in the offseason, and you can see what he's been able to do offensively over these past few years, even though there has been a little bit of regression ever since 2022, where he got 106 points, absolutely insane. He's still a player that is going to be an electrifying top six piece, an absolute power play weapon, and for the experience, the cups that he has, so many teams are going to be after him. Everybody is. Now, the thing is, Stamkos will always be a winger on your team, but he does take a lot of face-offs. So I guess you could maybe qualify him as a center then if you really wanted to. Of course, again, with the rumors of Boston and how much they could use a first-line center, Stamkos could be pretty interesting there. But I definitely see Stamkos taking a shorter-term contract, but for a big AAV, especially if he's going to go to a team that's not Tampa Bay. I think he'd want to get the most amount possible. I don't know if he goes to like $9 million or something, but maybe if it's like a 2-year deal or something, we see a team go that crazy, especially if they're in desperate need for a guy like him. Next up now, let's go on to one of the most high-profile UFAs, and of course, one of the highest-profile trade deadline acquisitions in Jake Guentzel, who found his way to the Carolina Hurricanes, and I think it'll be absolutely amazing that he did because of what he's been able to prove so far in Carolina. You can see what he's been able to do with Pittsburgh, the consistent production, but there will always be those naysayers that say, oh, the production is just because of Crosby. Well, Guentzel's proving that he could produce outside of Crosby and produce some pretty good numbers. 14 assists, 16 points in 11 games. He has been brilliant over there, and that to me is really going to raise his stock. The fact that he proved that he can produce somewhere else in a new situation and instantly click. And I think for that, he is going to get a massive bag. We're probably going to see him upwards of $9 million, perhaps, maybe even more than that. Some team could be pretty crazy and offer him a whole heck of a lot. Now, speaking of a team potentially going crazy, let's go on to number one and maybe the best free agent available. And next we go on to the Florida Panthers yet again with Sam Reinhart. And it is going to be fascinating to see what Reinhart gets, especially since he's one of the more younger high-profile free agents, turning 29 in November. He's not on the wrong side of 30 yet and only has a couple more years to do that. But you can see what he's been able to accomplish this season with the Panthers. 52 goals, 87 points in 75 games. And even though I don't think he's going to replicate that on another team, he would be fascinating. Could Reinhart get $10 million in free agency this year? That's going to be the big question, honestly. But even though there is the chance that he stays in Florida, I just think he's played so well that he's almost priced himself out, which is unfortunate, but the Panthers have still benefited from his incredible play. But those are the top 25 free agents this year, and I would love to know your thoughts down below. Who do you see as the best and the worst on this list? Who do you want to see your team go after in free agency? And where do you see these guys going? What are your predictions? Let us know all your thoughts down below. Of course, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell if you haven't already, and share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online, and click on this card as well for all of my hockey rankings content right in one playlist. And I will see you in the next one. I hope you have a fantastic hockey day, and goodbye.